Welcome to the CDA Institute's Expert Series, the podcast that brings you critical discussions with thought leaders in defense, security, and global affairs. I'm your host, Josh Malm. The CDA Institute encourages rigorous debate on national security matters through our events, research, and publications. In today's episode, Dr. Alexander Moens and Dr. Ryan Dean, directors of the NATO Field School and Simulation Program at Simon Fraser University, offer their reflections on last week's NATO summit in Washington and dissect the major takeaways both for Canada and the alliance at large. The NATO Field School and Simulation Program is open to students from all NATO nations. The program gives students the opportunity to observe professionals and experts in their working environment and be immersed in the decisions that political, diplomatic, and military personnel face. This includes visits across Europe, including NATO HQ, SHAPE, the European External Action Services, the NATO Strategic Communication Center of Excellence, and many more. Students will also develop and test their skills through negotiation and decision-making simulations with mentorship from senior officials and diplomats. Like a dynamic practicum or apprenticeship, the NATO Field School prepares people for entry-level employment in foreign affairs, defense policy, and various national and international security sectors, as well as international NGO sectors. This is the Expert Series. Dr. Moens and Dr. Dean, pleasure to have you on the Expert Series podcast today. As we both know, the NATO summit happened over the weekend in Washington. So thank you for coming on, and I'm looking forward to hearing your reflections on the summit. Why don't we get started? So for both of you, what do you think were maybe some of the most important takeaways from this year's summit declaration?
Well, if you don't mind me jumping in, I was shocked at how short it was. It was only about 38 paragraphs in comparison to Vilnius Declaration was about 90. And what really struck me was Secretary Blinken's speech, which celebrated NATO as the strongest alliance in history, over 1 billion people and growing, longest multilateral alliance upholding rules-based international order. And Secretary Austin called NATO one of the greatest success stories ever known. And the three big points that jumped out to me were going beyond 2% GDP spending, hybrid warfare could lead to Article 5, and the PCR, the People's Republic of China, was mentioned 3 times as a decisive enabler of Russia, working to reshape that rules-based international order. And its growing capabilities were continuously mentioned throughout the public forum.
Yeah, like my colleague mentioned, it's a shorter declaration, and it holds maybe a few new terms that are of significance. As Ryan said, the decisive enabler is a label that NATO has now officially attached to China, in addition to strategic competitor. This one is more significant in the sense that NATO has attached to this designation a specific demand, namely that China halt its shipments of components of weapons and other materials supporting directly Russia in its aggressive war against Ukraine. So we could, for example, in the future look towards what will the next steps be if China does not halt these shipments. So in NATO's logic, once you identify a problem directly to NATO, then you identify what NATO's demands and action can be. The other thing that I found interesting in the same context is there was much less controversy regarding Ukraine's membership, even though there wasn't really any progress either. But there was this term that Ukraine would irreversibly join the Euro-Atlantic area, including NATO membership. I'm not sure if the Ukrainians are greatly comforted by that statement, but of course, irreversible is a powerful word.
So, well, thank you both. Those are some great points, and some of which we'll touch on in a few minutes. But to follow on from there, what would you say are some of the key outcomes, perhaps, for Canada at the NATO summit in Washington, particularly regarding our commitment to the 2% threshold for defense spending, which has been a very large topic in the lead up to the summit?
Well, Canada was an outlier not having a plan to get to 2% before the summit. And now it does, however rudimentary that plan is. And what really surprised me was when Minister Blair stated Canada might need to go beyond that 2% to properly meet its defense commitments. I expected Canada to be a laggard here, not rhetorically leaning into this. And indeed, the notion of 2% increasingly representing a floor in defense spending was made clear throughout the summit for the alliance. Plus, as Secretary General Stoltenberg said, it's hard to spend 2%. Canada is not alone in having a hard time doing this. The industrial capacity is just not there yet. And I hope this is something we can unpack throughout the rest of this podcast.
Yeah. NATO, of course, has a fantastic capacity to phrase things just right so that all 32 allies can unite in consensus, which is required for the alliance to do anything at all. So if you look at this phrase around the defense investment pledge, you'll find an interesting little phrase in the middle of the sentence. So basically, the allies agree to move beyond the 2023 defense investment pledge. They reaffirm that, and then they say, we reaffirm that in many cases, expenditure beyond 2% of GDP will be needed. Notice the phrase, in many cases. So there is a little bit of wiggle room there. I'm hopeful, like Ryan, that Canada will take its path to 2% seriously. A lot of time before it reaches it. So we'll see. But we agree strongly that Canada needs to take its reinvestment and renewal of its defense capacity very, very seriously. And the allies are now watching the days when Canada was sort of, a little bit not too worried about it. I think they're over. I think the allies are watching. And of course, Trump is another factor that's behind all of this, because we have to anticipate that if Trump is elected, that he might take Canada's security and defense profile quite seriously.
Well, thank you both for your answers there. Before we dive a bit more into defense spending, I'm wondering if you might be able to offer your reflections on what you think interactions may have been between Canada and its allies behind closed doors at this year's summit.
Well, I did not see the Prime Minister at the public forum, but I did see his press conference in which he, let's be honest, he looked somewhat annoyed, a little bit flustered by things. Clearly, he'd been under significant pressure to get there. He did say we would get to that 2% spending, and they did produce, a plan to get us there in the 11th hour. Likely the reasoning is it's better to be nudged out the door by a Biden presidency than shoved out the door by a possible Trump one.
Yeah, that's well put. Already last year at the Vilnius summit, I also really noticed, I was there at the time, and I noticed the Prime Minister coming into his panel late, looking quite flustered and quite pressed about, and not necessarily his smiley self. Took him a while to get back to that. And you can just imagine that, around the summit table, the leaders actually speak quite frankly with each other. And of course, with President Biden being trusted and respected by nearly all the allies very, very strongly, you could expect a very frank discussion about this. So we will be keeping a very close eye on what Canada is going to do in the next year.
Back to defense spending. So following the summit, following the announcement, what do you think are some of the next steps for Canada in implementing some of its defense spending timelines?
I'd say the major thing is to try to add some details to this plan to get to 2%. We need more on the submarine acquisition. What does this Canada, Germany, Norway defense production agreement look like? There's all sorts of details and nuance that is missing here in the larger conversation regarding Canada and our defense spending. Furthermore, Canada's made huge spending commitments across the life of the Trudeau government, and the federal bureaucracy is greatly expanded. So we're running these big deficits. How can we as a country get to 2% given this larger economic picture? And finally, how much spending do we actually need to satisfy our defense commitments? Likely more than the 2%, as Minister Blair alluded to in his panel at the public forum.
It's very interesting that I think it's the former Prime Minister of Sweden, Carl Bildt. Interesting that he mentioned that really NATO allies need to understand that we're talking 4% of GDP in order to get to a level where now in Europe, governments are very much focused on a level where if you had a scenario where Russia somehow got rewarded for its aggression in Ukraine and had a capacity to rebuild its military machine and continue to have these aggressive demands on Europe, then there's a lot of things that need to be done, including for Canada, for example, in the North Atlantic, in the whole question of protecting the northern flanks, which was traditionally our role as well in NATO, extremely important role for us to play there. Ryan, my colleague, he's an expert also on the Arctic and High North. So even apart from NATO, we have tremendous security interests there that we need to serve. And we have some ambitions and some hopes to be a helpful democratic ally in the Asia Pacific, in the Pacific region. If you think of those three areas, the great peace dividend that people thought there was, I was never a particular follower of peace dividend theory, but the great peace dividend is long gone, and Canada is no longer sitting in a fireproof house. It's actually sitting in a triangle of threats: the Arctic, the Pacific, and the Euro-Atlantic. And if we cannot take care of ourselves, we will not be able to pursue our interests or our values.
Some of our allies, as well as experts, have suggested that maybe Canada narrow in on a few areas where we can really be effective instead of perhaps spreading ourselves too thin. How might this come into play in the Arctic, for instance, since you've brought up Arctic security, and how might Canada be able to do this realistically and in the shorter to medium term?
Well, I think something Canada has to do is, if you look at our defense policy update, we talk about NATO's western flank, which is our NORAD US Northcom commitments. We talk about a northern area, which we haven't defined as a flank. And then you see that our Latvia battle group commitment is placed in the eastern flank of the alliance. That's a tremendous amount of territory that we're spread across. I think concentrating those forces maybe in that North Atlantic, that glue that holds these three different flanks together, is a sensible place for us to put our defense effort, to concentrate our forces there so they can jump off into those different flanks as necessary. But what that looks like, I'm not sure. I was quite shocked by Minister Blair. When he was on an Arctic panel, he never mentioned anything like, say, submarines as that talking point on an Arctic panel. That was part of the public forum. He did state that there were gaps in the Arctic and that they would be addressed by NATO, which was something I found quite fascinating. He did focus on Canada's domain awareness or lack of domain awareness and trying to build it across the Arctic, across the North Atlantic. I think that's incredibly important. But he said these capabilities were being delayed. And again, that's where that 2% spending comes in. We might have to go about it. And that, again, this is where Blair announced that Canada, Germany, Norway defense production agreement, and somehow linking it to that greater North Atlantic, high Arctic, high European Arctic gap that he alluded to. So we'll see how that plays out going forward.
You know, Ryan and I, we spent 8 weeks in Europe, and we were both struck by how many of the conversations in NATO's operational commands, at SHAPE, in other fora, NATO fora, how often the conversation included the high north or the Arctic. I've not heard it as much as this year. So even if you don't find a lot of it specifically in the declaration, all levels of NATO, or many levels of NATO, are thinking much more about the high north and its implications. Now, of course, Russia is the only non-NATO Arctic power, and all the others are NATO countries. So in a way, Canada can also facilitate, if it puts its mind around it, a NATO high north conversation and enablement, rather than be the slow person on the block. This would be in our interest to facilitate. The other thing I noticed is, besides how serious the Europeans are taking security, is how serious the Americans are taking it. For example, not quite specific part of the summit, but announced about the same time. Maybe Ryan heard something about this or not, but I noticed it in the reports coming out. The United States announced essentially that as of 2026 is going to place medium-range missiles in Germany, and these are it's announced as essentially SM-6 non-nuclear, as well as Tomahawk cruise missiles. But the point here is very, very important. Given what Russia is doing in terms of conventional warfare, and given what Russia is doing in its nuclear saber rattling, the United States has decided, and NATO has discussed and endorsed this, to put missiles in Germany, which will have Moscow directly in their range. And this is what goes back to the 1980s, when this counter threat to Russia was really necessary, and the Americans took it very seriously. We all remember the long history of it. But now we're back at this point.
Well, thank you both. One more question about Canada before we get into some more general aspects and other findings of the summit. And that's something we've kind of discussed a little bit now, but haven't focused too much on yet in this discussion. What would you say were the reactions of some of the other NATO member states to Canada's submarine replacement announcement? And how might this move potentially influence collaborative defense initiatives, especially those concerning maritime security in the North Atlantic and Arctic?
Well, it's sad to report that I didn't really notice a lot of reaction to this at the public forum. The conversation there was very much stayed at the level of Canada needs to get to 2% and provide a plan as to how it's going to get there. There was no real nuance around how Canada is going to get this or get to the spending goal and how it could contribute to things like North Atlantic security. That level of fine-grained detail is just missing from the overall discussion. Like I said, though, the big announcement from Minister Blair to me was this Canada, Germany, Norway defense production agreement that had been announced. I think it was last fall, if memory serves. I guess they've signed off on it. It's going to go ahead. Maybe this is going to include submarines, maybe other things, but that notion of Canada working with our allies and engaging in that sort of burden sharing to help mitigate the pressure defense spending is placed on us. One of the major messages coming out from this is that the allies can kind of mitigate the defense spending through burden sharing through the alliance. And a lot of talks at the public forum were very much about how we can reorganize defense production capabilities of the alliance to produce the materials necessary to prosecute a prolonged great power war, worst case scenario. And they were doing this with institutionalized spending commitments to give industry the certainty that it needs to retool itself from this sort of output, moving from that post-Cold War peace dividend to having the capabilities and the deep magazines that enable NATO to credibly deter and defend, if necessary, the overall alliance.
There's various opportunities out there. Let's recall that Article 2 of the Alliance, which is still, of course, known as in the Canada clause informally. That article is about how to increase the economic and other aspects of the military alliance. And given the fact that we in Canada, but many of our NATO partners, don't have enough manpower, person power, don't have enough industrial capacity, working together with an economic industrial powerhouse like Germany could be a very good win-win scenario for us. So I'm hoping we'll be able to develop that, as well as with some of our Indo-Pacific partners, by the way. So I think it's a matter of prime ministerial attention. I've always thought that unless the prime minister puts his or her mind to defense, it's going to drift. And when he or she does, then we have an opportunity to get our house in order. But as Ryan said too, at the moment, our allies are not looking very much at the little dribble bits of announcements we make, because they're just that, little dribble bits. And unless we get our reputation back up to where we're taken seriously, they're not going to pay that much attention to us.
Well, thanks, Dr. Moens. So just to sort of summarize this portion of the conversation before I move on quickly to a few topics I'd like to cover, like China, Trump, and support for Ukraine, I'm hoping you might be able to just offer some final reflections for listeners who might not follow defense so closely on what this summit meant for Canada ultimately, and how Canada looked at the summit.
Well, I think, officials speaking at the public forum kept emphasizing that public forum that our defense spending is emphasized around Western defense industry, still based around that post-Cold War peace dividend, as I mentioned. And it's about trying to get our populations to make that paradigm shift, to move from that peace dividend of the 1990s to this current world of strategic competition, and starting to realize that we have to take these foreign policy commitments much more seriously to be a credible ally, to deter our adversaries. And for Canada, it's trying to build ourselves into that ecosystem of institutionalized spending commitments in collaboration with our allies to help generate those kinds of industrial capabilities, to engage in the radical restructuring that the defense industry needs to be able to meet the demands of this new era of strategic competition. That was a major message I took away from the public forum.
I'm hoping that the Prime Minister and the Canadian political leaders will play their role in educating the Canadian public, the Canadian electorate, about why this matters. That NATO is not just some foreign nuisance that knocks on our door and says, spend money, but that NATO is and remains, hence the 75th celebration, NATO remains the key enabler of Canadian defense. And it is in our interest not to be a laggard. And the Canadian Prime Minister, and I hear from Ryan that Minister Blair was beginning to do this, and the Canadian Prime Minister, I hope, and future Prime Ministers will help and make the Canadian public understand why this matters. And maybe we'll have to think about some rearrangement of spending. We might have to reduce some areas of domestic spending in order to have sufficient defense spending, because the Canadian taxpayer is not an unlimited resource. So you don't get this debate until the leadership brings it to us. And the NATO summit says, pay attention, Canada, you need to start doing this now.
Well, Dr. Moens and Dr. Dean, thank you for your reflections. Before we close out this interview, I just have a few other areas I'd like to quickly touch on, hopefully. The first, what would you say are the strategic implications? This is something we talked about earlier. What are the strategic implications of NATO's assertion that China is a quote-unquote decisive enabler of Russia's war in Ukraine? And how might this impact NATO's diplomatic and security strategies, especially in relation to China's growing global influence?
Well, like Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg's told the public forum China is increasingly on NATO's radar. And the PRC is key to Russia reconstituting its military and adapting its economy to a war footing. And naming the PRC as an enabler of Russia helps clarify to the Chinese that they cannot have it both ways. They can't benefit economically from the rules-based international order while working politically to undermine it through partners like Russia. I think we can clearly link the threat of hybrid warfare here. And there was a great panel on the axis of upheaval that looked at China as this enabler of Russia and Iran and how China basically uses those two countries. And it's this notion of the autocracies versus democracies of the world. And the main message was that a loss in Ukraine would embolden these autocratic actors to undertake revisionist action elsewhere in the world. And lastly, as Secretary Blinken said, NATO can start to, perhaps say, mitigate or temper Chinese global influence by investing in ourselves in things like microchips and rare earths, and aligning NATO with its Indo-Pacific partners of Australia, Japan, New Zealand, and South Korea, as Dr. Mullen said. After all, we're all liberal democracies.
Yeah, I think this is a significant piece because for some years now, Washington has been trying to get its European allies to understand the threat. I know NATO doesn't use the word quite yet, not quite the word threat, but to understand the challenge of China and why it is in NATO's interest to align more closely with the US position on China, and why it's very dangerous, if not impossible, for Europe to sort of try to find a neutral middle way between the United States and China. And I think this summit really shows that Europe is coming to see this more and more. And the NATO alliance helps the two sides of the Atlantic to coordinate how to deal with China.
Wondering what strategic initiatives were agreed upon at the summit to enhance support for Ukraine. And I'm wondering if you can describe how Canada's additional $500 million military aid fit into the larger framework of NATO's response to the ongoing war in Ukraine.
Well, the language at the summit was based around building a bridge for the inevitable Ukrainian membership in NATO. And I think this rhetoric was trying to address some of the uncertainty Ukraine found last year at the Vilnius summit. And the four pillars that supported this bridge are NATO security assistance and training for Ukraine, pledge for long-term security assistance for Ukraine for reliable supply of war materials, NATO-Ukraine joint analysis, training in an education center to learn from the war, and the appointment of a senior representative in Ukraine. And Secretary Stoltenberg elaborated on this long-term support a bit more. He said, we've got the NATO command for Ukraine, more institutionalized support, so NATO simply can't wait Russia simply can't wait NATO out, and more concrete actions like military support for air defense, the new Patriot systems that were sent there, the F-16s that are now coming online or that are operational in Ukraine this summer, bilateral security agreements, and just that emphasis of more interoperability with Ukraine. I think overall, it's trying to move from this ad hoc approach that saw gaps in support to Ukraine that had serious consequences for the war there to an institutionalized support to increase the likelihood of delivery of these materials. Secretary General, he spoke of this pattern of Russian aggression to Ukraine. You can't can't let Russia keep taking slices of Ukraine between ceasefires. And if the fighting is to stop, Ukraine's going to have to look for membership in Article 5 there. And Canada's contribution, for instance, of that $500 million in military aid, it fits into this larger ecosystem of institutionalized spending commitments that we're collaborating with our allies on. Like I said, to help our industry get into that radical restructuring, to start building that magazine capacity to enable credible deterrence and defense, collective defense.
The alliance in its declaration carefully notes that NATO is not going to be a party to the war. Having said that, however, just as Dr. Dean just mentioned, short of that, this summit moves NATO qua alliance closer and closer to formally supporting Ukraine in many, many ways, including what we all have come to know as the Ramstein format. That was an ad hoc, like Ryan mentioned, an ad hoc arrangement still is run by the US. And frankly, people are worried that President Trump may not continue to do that. So NATO has taken it in its arms to try to make sure it's institutionalized and that it will continue. This, I think, is, if I were President Zelensky, I would see many small steps of improvement for Ukraine. We see at the same time on the battlefield that the new weapons are coming and that they are still making a difference, that longer range strikes into Russia are now possible by Ukraine, my apologies. And that as a result, the Russian momentum is again going down. Hopefully leading Ukraine to a capacity to force Russia to cease.
Well, this is a good segue for my last question, Dr. Moens. And I'll know that the CDA recently put out a podcast on this very topic last week, which you can still check out. I believe it's still quite relevant. So you bring up former President Mr. Donald Trump. What measures would you say NATO leaders are considering at this moment to maybe quote unquote Trump-proof the alliance? And how might their strategies impact the cohesion and effectiveness of NATO in the event of former President Donald Trump's return to office?
At the public forum, I think Secretary Austin's speech did a lot here, and his was arguing that the United States was a net benefactor from the alliance. He mentioned that, quote, America is stronger, safer, and secure with allies. And that undermining NATO undermines America. And he recalled how NATO stood with the US when it invoked Article 5 during 9/11. And he emphasized that the US was thus going to stand with NATO going forward. And he laid out this family of plans around scaling up defense production and deepening with cooperation with Ukraine on its defense. So basically, the US is entrenching its commitments for these sorts of long-term plans to make breaking either NATO or those commitments within the alliance much harder to do for a potential Trump presidency.
Yeah, I think the same, that the alliance in its deployments, in its production, and in its diplomatic achievements have created a web of interest that includes the United States interest that would be very costly for the US to pull away from. And ultimately, we know that the United States offers decisive political persuasion to its allies. And when it stops doing that, it will make NATO very shrill, or what French President Macron meant by brain dead. And the United States ultimately is the military enabler of the alliance. And if it stops doing that, its military capacity will take a major setback. So we're entering a year where, first of all, if President Biden does not prevail, we will have to look at some serious impact on the alliance. But I don't know if the Trump idea of neglecting, belittling, setting aside the alliance will ultimately prevail. I am not convinced yet. It may just be that once in office, even the President, Trump, won't see more benefit than cost.
Well, Dr. Moens and Dr. Dean, thank you so much for your reflections on this year's summit in Washington. Really great conversation, very enriching. I think our audience will find a lot of value in this discussion. You, of course, both run the NATO Field School program, so I'm hoping you might be able to speak to our audience a little bit about the program and perhaps the experiences of students, both of yourselves, too, at this year's Washington Summit. So go ahead if you would like.
Well, it's the 7th year was this year for the NATO Field School, year 7. It is an absolutely a wonderful program from the point of view of the students, because I've never seen in my 35 years of teaching so much positive feedback from our students. And the reason is because it's a real engagement experiential program. In other words, we spend some time online to get all our major pieces in place, but then we literally go and observe NATO installations, NATO deployments, NATO commands, NATO centers of excellence. We observe them and we interact with these professionals, military and civilian. And then the students get some of the best mentorship from NATO's own mentors to do simulations that are very realistic. So they create a level of professional confidence, a level of professional experience that they are then able to translate into internships and jobs, career positions. I am extremely grateful that Dr. Dean joined me this year, and his work and his focus on the High North allowed many of the students to study that extra dimension in depth. And I'm sure, Ryan, that you came away with many experiences and observations about the field school yourself.
Oh, it was absolutely tremendous. Josh, these are the kind of students professors dream of teaching. Professionally, extremely rewarding. The amount we were able to do taking students across NATO, essentially, to visit, the various domains, to see them in practice, to speak with them, to have that hands-on, to talk to mentors, to do the simulations. Incredible, absolutely incredible. I wish a program like this existed when I was in my undergraduate, when I was doing my master's. It doesn't. I definitely think this experiential learning is definitely the way of the future for university. The student feedback has been tremendous. The students were great. I was even lucky enough, the NATO Field School, we're in our 2nd year now as an institutionalized partner of NATO public diplomacy. They were able to fund 5 of our NATO alumni to head down to the Washington Summit. And, I'd like to give a big shout out to Amy, Josephine, Sasha, Ethan, and George for being incredible ambassadors of the Field School there, and I dare say the larger NATO alliance. And hopefully you can find all the social media links that you did on the information below in this podcast.
Well, that's fantastic. Thanks for talking a little bit about the NATO Field School as well, Alex and Ryan. I'd also note that a few of my colleagues here at the CDA have been through the NATO Field School program. I'm thinking our research coordinator, Lauren Mannix, and my former colleague, Megan Scheidel, who was a research coordinator and now works for PCO. So for our young professionals listening, I can attest that the NATO Field School is indeed a great program, and I would encourage you all to check it out if you're interested. Alex and Ryan, thanks so much for joining me once again. This has been a very enriching conversation. Alex, great to have you on again. And Ryan, thanks for coming on for your first appearance on the Expert Series. And I hope we can do this again in the future. So thank you very much both for your time today. That's all for this week's episode of the CDA Institute's Expert Series. To learn more about the CDA Institute, you can visit our website at www.cdainstitute.ca or subscribe to our newsletter. Stay tuned this Friday for the latest installment of the Geopolitical Update podcast hosted by Joe Barner. Thanks, and we hope you'll be joining us next time.